All right, this is a revision of mini lecture 5. I had a number of comments that the sound was off, so we're going to do this again. And again, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the global labor, the geography of labor, in terms of employment, unemployment, and also in terms of wages. The issue of wages, of course, and where labor occurs and what people are employed in. And then we're going to move into something called the formal and informal economy, and that is the types of activities that people do in their regulation. And lastly, we'll be talking a little bit about how all of these relate then to the urban geography that we're going to be talking about next week. So let's get started. Okay, first of all, we're going to be talking about employment and unemployment. We're going to define what that means. We're going to be talking then about what people are employed in, that's by sector. We're going to be talking a little bit about wages and their variability. And then we're going to be talking again about that idea of the formal and informal sectors of the economy and the movement towards urbanization. All right, so first of all, employment means that you are working. And that's kind of a simple statement, but in fact, what we really are talking about, the labor force. In other words, for a country, what is their labor force? And that in general means, first of all, people that are employed, plus the people that are looking for work. And what that means by looking means that you are old enough to work, generally speaking in the United States, that means 16 and above, and you've been looking for employment at least in the last 4 weeks. So we take the number of people that are unemployed and then we divide that by the total labor force, and that gives us our unemployment rate. What we think generally is that roughly about 3.5% unemployment is essentially full. That means that it's everybody that wants to work or can work is working. If we look at the world today, of course, many things in the news are talking about how the unemployment rate has really spiked. And that is, again, that's a reality. But if we take a step back from this extremely unusual situation, what we can see is that globally, unemployment or full employment was pretty close to being present in much of the world in 2019. That is, the economy in terms of jobs was going along pretty well. Now, you will notice that there are some very distinct trends in this. North America and much of South America was fairly well employed, and it was only in sub-Saharan Africa, Southwest Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe that we saw moderately high levels of unemployment. You'll notice also Spain kind of sticks out. We saw some moderate levels of unemployment in a couple of countries, but also remember that some of these countries have significant social safety nets, and that unemployment is a little bit more complicated in those areas. All right, so global unemployment. Now let's look at the United States. And you'll notice that rate, U.S. rate of unemployment, and this is 2018, was 3.9%. And for all intents and purposes, we're approaching full employment there. But that doesn't mean that that was the case everywhere. You'll notice that, for example, Illinois was moderately higher, as was where we are located. There's fairly high unemployment rates, kind of down along this Appalachian belt here, and in the area of southern Mississippi into Louisiana. The Midwest, the Plains region here, though, had very, very low unemployment rates. Now, understand that employment doesn't mean necessarily wages. This means that people are simply employed. And in the United States, we had some very uneven employment rates. Some counties and states were doing extremely well, others were doing extremely poorly. And so the Southwest, the Pacific Northwest, and then kind of along this Appalachian and the Mississippi Basin, we saw some real declines in employment or, in a sense, higher unemployment. And we'll talk a little bit about perhaps why that is the case. So when we talk about employed persons, the other piece of this, of course, is what are people doing? And when we look at employment, total employed persons in the United States in 2019, we want to look at it by sector. And one of the things that we see in the United States is, again, and this is in thousands, so if you want to think about this, we have nearly 35 million people employed in various forms of education and health services, all of those activities. Retail sales and then professional business services are the top three. Now, why manufacturing, why people always talk about manufacturing, is that it's still a significant uh, component of our economy and our labor force. But you'll notice that as we look at those different sectors, the tertiary sector is number one, number two, number three, number five, number seven, and then let's see, that makes that 9 and 10. Whereas our primary sectors, agriculture, way down at the bottom, as is mining. So our primary sectors essentially are the bottom of our economy in terms of total number of jobs, and our tertiary sector is the top. The secondary sector is important, but not nearly as important if you combine these three. And so where people are employed is very important. And then how do we modify or work with that unemployment rate depends on which areas they can fit into. Okay, so change by sector. The other thing that we want to look at, and again, I just pulled, this is for the second quarter to third quarter of 2019. And the question is, where is growth? Where are jobs gaining? And again, what we notice very clearly is that if we look at job growth, here we have education and health services, finance, government, leisure and hospitality, and professional. All of those are, again, our tertiary sectors. You'll notice here our primary sector, mining and logging, is declining. And so when we look at this, we have to see where the growth in jobs is in the United States. And that's, again, an important idea. Where do we put our effort? By focusing on different areas, we change the economy. And policy is what does that. Okay, so one of the ways that we also want to see this, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the case study of what we call the Rust Belt. So again, for your notes, the Rust Belt is this area in the mid-Atlantic primarily, although it extends all the way up into Maine here, where between the 1950s and 2000, there was a significant loss in jobs. And if you'll notice that in this case, there were areas that lost greater than 80% of their jobs. And if you look at, for example, this area here in Pittsburgh and its surrounding environments up in Maine and into Ohio, we see this massive loss of jobs. And this is why we term it the Rust Belt. In other words, the industrial belt, the steel belt, essentially declined. Those jobs were lost at an amazing rate. And it really affected these economies. Now, that doesn't mean that those economies are still that way. Obviously, Pittsburgh is a great example where the decline, this whole area, the decline in the steel industry and in manufacturing was largely replaced by movements towards healthcare, service sector, and high tech. And so again, transformations in jobs and what people do is not always a bad thing. Okay, so why does this happen? Why do jobs move? Why does manufacturing go where manufacturing does? Well, a lot of it has to do with what we pay in wages. And I want to focus on this idea of the minimum wage. Minimum wage by country is that is set. And what we notice is very clearly that minimum wages vary significantly across the globe. The highest minimum wages are in Western Europe, and then into the United States, Canada, Australia, and the lowest wages tend to be in South Asia and Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, where the data is available. And so what that says is that in terms of basic wages, the cost of labor is highest in Europe, and then into North America and Australia, Japan, and it is lowest in Central and South America and Southeast and South Asia. This means that if you need basic labor and your other costs are somewhat fixed, labor costs can be modified by moving where you manufacture. Now, manufacturing is a special case, and it's worth understanding how that works. You need in manufacturing at least a moderate level of skill. And so it's not just the cost of labor at the minimum wage, it's the cost of labor in terms of doing things that are moderately skilled. And again, one of the things that we notice is the United States is not the most expensive, but it's also by far not the least expensive. And so when we think about basic manufacturing, one of the things that we see is that much of this area here, so you think about Brazil and Taiwan and Mexico and the Philippines, these are areas where manufacturing exists significantly and that the cost is so much less than in, for example, the United States or in Europe. And so this is why we have this idea of offshoring or outsourcing of labor, because the cost of labor is cheaper. And if you're simply interested in how much it costs and the profit margin, then you're going to move to where your labor costs are least, all other things being equal. In the case of Mexico, this is particularly true because of its proximity to the US market, so your transportation costs essentially are the same, but your labor costs are significantly less. Okay, now, average salaries are not just for manufacturing. You'll notice that this is actually the case in a lot of other skilled or tertiary industries. You'll notice, for example, nursing. Now, again, you can't obviously outsource nursing. You have to have nurses where you are. But you'll notice that in some cases, the United States has some of the highest levels of pay for this tertiary industry. And now Australia, China also extremely high. But we can look at a couple of the other ones. Accounting. Again, another tertiary industry, extremely high in much of Western Europe and in the United States, significantly lower in other parts of the world. Retail associates, retail sales, moderately high in the United States, and a little bit higher in terms of what we would expect to see in Mexico and in terms of Northern Europe. So, what does that mean? Well, it means that in all sectors, there are differences in incomes and how oftentimes the society values those. The other thing, though, that happens is that as wages are higher in certain areas, that pulls people. And so what I want to talk about very briefly is this idea of wages, and wages in cities tend to be higher than wages in rural areas. In fact, also the opportunities for jobs are higher in urban areas. And what that has done is that is what we call a pull factor, pulling people into urban areas, seeking employment, seeking higher wages. And what you can see over time is that globally, in other words, 1950, 30% of the world lived in urban areas. Today, essentially, it's about 60% or almost 60%, and that is expected to grow significantly. So people come for work. This leads us to the idea of the formal and informal sector. So when we talk about economies also, we talk about those parts of the economy, especially in terms of labor, where the worker either works in the formal economy or in the informal economy. Now, virtually all of you have probably worked in both sectors. The formal economy means that part of the economy where things are essentially formalized through state relationships. And this is how it works. Imagine you work at the outlet mall. Okay, well, that means that you have to learn. When I say formal training here, it may be as simple as learning to run a cash register, learning to do a bank deposit, learning to do inventories. These are formal skills that you'll learn even at a retail sales location. It might be something much more complicated in terms of accounting or nursing. But what comes along with that is that most of, or really virtually all of the formal economy jobs have a defined and agreed upon wage per unit of time, and they have fixed hours. Now, what that also relates to is that the formal economy interacts with the government through taxation and income reporting. It also means that the government responds to that by dictating certain health and safety regulations. So the formal economy is a regulated portion of the economy. And why it matters to governments is this is where they gain taxation and their ability to do things with those taxes. The flip side of that, and I'll give you an example, any of you that have babysat, any of you that have mowed lawns for cash, these are the informal economy. They don't necessarily require any formal training, or very little. Their hours are largely determined by you. I want to babysit or I don't want to babysit. And the wages are typically simply agreed upon on the spot. Now, the other part of that, though, is that when you're a babysitter, or when you mow lawns, there is no formal legal protection to that job. In other words, if you mow a lawn and you twist your ankle, well, you might be able to sue someone for it, but there's really very little that you can do in terms of how you interact. Now, the good side of that is that you're working for cash, and so you don't pay any taxes. You don't report the income in most cases, especially when we talk about informal economy, that's simply what it means. But again, there are no safety or health regulations in that environment. You simply choose to do what you do. So what we recognize in the world today is that many people migrate to urban areas, at least in terms of those migrants that are either international or less formal. And in that migration, they typically fall into the informal sector of the economy first because it is the easiest way to move into it. And I want to give a contrast here. So this is a market district of Giant Eagle. And the reason I use this picture is that it represents all of the formal economy activities. The clerks, they might be unionized. They have regulations in terms of their hours and their wages. The materials that you see there are all produced in factories with federal regulations in terms of what they include, what they contain, their packaging. Everything here is regularized. You pay taxes on what you buy, and in fact, the people working there pay taxes on their wages earned, and the company even pays part of their welfare taxes, if you will. Their Social Security benefits, their Medicare, Medicaid benefits might all be paid. They might even have a healthcare system within it. Now contrast that with this situation. This happens to be in Peru, and this is a woman that has her own produce stand. Now she takes everything in cash. There is no alternative other than cash there. She doesn't report, for the most part, any of her wages. The only thing that is part of even a remotely formal economy here is that she does pay rent for the stall. We can go one step further, and outside of this market, these were women that were selling tamales. And again, no regulation on their food production, no regulation on sanitary characteristics to them, and they also set up whenever they wanted to and went home whenever they wanted to. But again, this is the informal economy. Now, there are again gray areas in this. If you think about something like this is a taxi cab. This is what they call a mini taxi. And in this case, again, there is a moderate level of articulation with the economy. That is, the motorcycle driver had to get a motorcycle license. He, in all likelihood, I believe, if I remember correctly, he did have a medallion, but if I paid him cash, he kind of set it aside. And so formal and informal economies then move into this gray area. So in the urban areas, the informal economy is where people move into first. All right, that's it for this week. Again, I apologize for the lack of sound in the last one. We'll see you next week. And remember, exam on Monday.